In this third and last video on the history of American education, we'll look at the period from World War II through the present. When World War II began, thousands of young people dropped out of college to join the military. At the end of the war, the federal government sought to reward these young veterans and help them adjust to a peacetime economy. Congress, therefore, passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly referred to as the GI Bill of Rights. The GI Bill of Rights included among its provisions considerable education benefits. It made college education possible for millions by providing between 50 and 80% of the total cost, including foregone earnings in addition to tuition. The GI Bill, together with the booming economy of the post-World War II years, helped make a college education possible for a broad swath of Americans who had never before enjoyed the opportunity. Increasingly in the post-war years, the assumption grew that a college education was the norm, expected for advancement in society. The number of colleges increased tremendously, as did the size of their enrollments. In the post-World War II years, the nation was quickly embroiled in the Cold War. When the rival Soviet Union exploded a nuclear bomb in the late 1940s and, in 1957, were the first to send a satellite known as Sputnik into space, and you can see that on the bottom left here, and it shocked the American public. It appeared that the United States, which prided itself on its science and technological abilities, had fallen behind. Accordingly, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, which poured federal funds into math and science at both the secondary and collegiate levels. The federal government historically had left education policy and funding largely to the states. The GI Bill and the Defense Education Act were evidence that the federal government saw a national interest in promoting education at all levels. While this didn't please many conservatives, the aid to the states grew during the 1960s when Congress passed the Vocational Training Act of 1963 during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. This legislation provided federal funds for non-college educational training in the trades, especially those in high demand. The greatest increase in federal support for education came during the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, when Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It provided an astounding $1.3 billion in aid to schools, mostly those who served underprivileged children in poor communities. New schools were constructed, new teachers were hired, new equipment and books were purchased, and financial aid to students increased. For colleges and universities, LBJ got through Congress the Higher Education Act of 1965. For the first time, there was a massive program of federal scholarships and low-interest loans to needy college students. The GI Bill of Rights had provided scholarship money before, but only to veterans. This was available to all who needed low-interest college loans, which of course is how most people pay for colleges today. The funds were eventually set at $650 million. Later in 1966 and 68, additional funds were provided. The bill also provided for money for college libraries and research facilities, as well as funding a national teacher corps to provide and train qualified personnel for schools in poverty-stricken areas. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society also created the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which provided federal funds to promote the humanities and the arts. Of course, the most controversial move of the federal government in education involved race and equity. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the famous case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that segregated schools were unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In ruling that separate segregated educational facilities were always inherently unequal, the court reversed the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson 60 years before. Of course, the decision led to considerable backlash in the segregated South. Protests emerged as the public and many state governments claimed that they would resist. Many southern school districts claimed they couldn't desegregate because it would result in violence. In the subsequent Supreme Court case, commonly referred to as Brown 2 case, Supreme Court ruled that these school districts must desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. Many southern white parents took their children out of the public school system and put them in private schools, all white, of course, and they became known as the sort of segregationist academies. In Prince Edwards County, Virginia, the school system actually shut down rather than having to desegregate. Of course, most famously, in 1957, Dwight Eisenhower, the president, had to send federal troops to help desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you can see that here. The black student James Meredith enrolled at the University of Mississippi, which led to the Battle of Oxford, they called it, which killed 2 people and wounded 70. Eventually, the military quieted such violence across the South. Federal intervention in education assured controversy as the years passed. In 1962, the Supreme Court held in Engel v. Vitale that specific denominational prayers led by any school employees was unconstitutional, a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Many Christian conservatives were outraged, arguing that Washington was, quote, taking God out of the schools. This began a movement towards new parochial and private religious schools. The Catholic Church had long sought federal aid for its parochial schools, and the movement to have federal education dollars assist private schools grew in the decades that followed. Eventually, this concept spread into the ideas of vouchers and charter schools. The former were federal stipends to individual families to use to attend a private school of their choice. The latter were private schools that received federal funds. The idea was to foster competition and innovation between schools by allowing students to transfer to the school of their choice. Critics saw it as a retreat from integration and an attack on the idea of public education by depleting its resources. During the 1970s, with racial segregation still prevalent in schools because of segregated neighborhoods, the Supreme Court ruled that busing students to achieve integration was constitutional. Integration was considered an essential part of education and a public good. When school districts, however, began busing, once again racial unrest resulted. Many white parents didn't want their children bused to a then predominantly black school, or alternatively, having black children from other neighborhoods bused to their predominantly white school. Protest and violence resulted, most notably in Boston. Also in the 1970s, the Supreme Court ruled the use of corporal punishment, spanking or paddling or other reasonable physical coercion, was constitutional. Despite protest and research indicating that African American students were punished in such a way, disproportionately more than other students, in several states the practice is still allowed today. In 1972, Congress passed the Education Amendment Acts of 1972, which again expanded the federal role in education. Its most famous provision, Title IX, banned gender discrimination in any school or university that received federal money. The requirement transformed athletic opportunities for girls and young women. In the years that followed, new opportunities for females exploded at all levels, including sports such as field hockey, basketball, volleyball, soccer, tennis, and track. By the 1970s, many colleges and universities had begun transitioning to coeducation. Prior to this period, most states had operated both all-female and all-male colleges. Coeducation was seen as more equitable and central to the quality of education, but it also allowed colleges to grow. During the 1970s, Congress also passed the Education for All Handicapped Students Act of 1975, which was in subsequent years expanded and renamed with disabilities. The law combined and codified previous federal regulations and state laws that assured students with disabilities had access to equal educational opportunities. The law required appropriate adjustments when a disability was identified and led to the growth of special education programs in public schools. It allowed many students with disabilities to attend the same schools as their peers. By the 1970s, with the encouragement of the federal government, many school districts had begun offering bilingual education. It had first begun in Florida in the 1960s with the influx of Spanish-speaking Cubans fleeing the new communist regime of Fidel Castro in that country. During the 1970s, Spanish bilingual classes were common in states such as California and Southwest, where you'd expect. And of course today, English as a second language classes are common nationally. By the end of the 1970s, the dramatic growth of federal funds and requirements into American education culminated with the creation of the Department of Education in 1979 during the administration of President Jimmy Carter. Combining the various federal offices that had existed previously, the new cabinet-level department made administration of educational policy streamlined and more efficient, but it worried many conservatives who, again, saw it as an infringement on state rights. The rise of these conservatives in the states and the federal government during the 1980s with the administration of President Ronald Reagan witnessed a considerable shift in education policy. Federal funds for education were cut. At the collegiate level, many colleges and universities faced tighter budgets and began to raise their tuition to cover their expenses. Richer and more well-regarded colleges worked hard, and often successfully, to expand their endowments, allowing for greater scholarships. But many state schools and smaller liberal arts schools didn't have that luxury. Many of these schools began to cut programs and raise tuition, while many students, therefore, had to take out greater student loans. With a culture and an economy that stressed the necessity of a college education for the middle class, student loan debt grew tremendously in the following years, and of course remains a huge problem today. Today, collective student loan debt exceeds $1.5 trillion. Perhaps representative of the new conservatism, private for-profit colleges began to grow. One of the first was the University of Phoenix, which launched in the late 1970s. During the 1980s and 1990s, for-profit colleges expanded tremendously, most notably in areas such as technical and vocational education. These private for-profit colleges were free from accreditation, which conservatives argued spawned innovation. Throughout the 1990s, the homeschooling movement grew, another reflection of the cultural and political conservatism. Many parents rejected the effort to embrace multiculturalism and diversity in what they derided as, quote, government schools, while others had religious motives, believing the schools had stopped teaching morality when it had rejected school-led prayer or when it taught evolution. Even as conservatives increasingly found fault with the public schools, liberals had their own complaints. Because of its sheer size and number of students, Texas gained an outsized influence on American education as it became a national hub of textbook publishing and distribution. The powerful and conservative Texas State Board of Education had enormous sway over what was included or excluded from textbooks used nationally. Issues like evolution and historical race relations, liberals complained, were regressive. In recent years, as Texas has grown, this conservative dominance has waned. Certainly schools weren't immune from the larger culture. With easy access to guns, a massacre at Colorado's Columbine High School in 1999 left 12 students and one teacher dead. The perpetrators were students, raising the awareness of bullying and mental illness as well. 13 years later, in 2012, another massacre at Connecticut's Sandy Hook Elementary School left 20 young children and 6 faculty members dead, reiterating again all the cultural strains in society. In a sign of the times, armed, uniformed police officers began replacing hall monitors as the issue of school security took center stage. With so-called school resource officers becoming standard in many high schools, a stricter conduct policy increasingly coordinated with the criminal justice system. This, in turn, led to more debate as minority students once again were disproportionately affected. As the 21st century dawned, a bipartisan effort sought to improve the schools by combining the additional funding that many liberals sought with greater accountability and flexibility that many conservatives demanded. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, signed into law by President George W. Bush, included provisions for standardized testing, complete with a system for grading schools and allowing the transfer of students from those deemed inadequate. Even this legislation, however, proved divisive. It soon became apparent to critics that many schools that sought to avoid the penalties inherent in the system would teach to the test. This, they argued, hurt real education and critical thinking. While states were allowed to set their own standards according to the law, many conservatives increasingly argued that it still further nationalized education. In 2015, Congress allowed the core of the law to expire. Perhaps the biggest transformation in the last few years was the growth of online education, from the use of the internet in elementary classrooms to fully online degree programs at the collegiate level. New businesses and new for-profit schools moved into the market to facilitate the rapidly developing technology, often standardizing teaching across geographic lines. For faculty and students at the collegiate level, the growth of the internet transformed research. As always, debate followed. Many educators cited research that indicated in-person education was superior and argued that much of the learning took place at the interpersonal level. Other educators, however, recognized online education as a way to expand learning, a way to teach constituencies hard to reach. Many cash-starved states embraced online education as a way to cut costs, while many students at the collegiate level welcomed the flexibility. Today, of course, this debate rages. The debate over the future of education was on full display during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2021, which threw the entire educational system into turmoil. Forced to close, schools at all levels quickly tried to expand their online offerings with varying degrees of success. Many parents worried that their children were receiving an inadequate education and were falling behind, while many teachers feared for their lives serving in person. Colleges across the nation adopted their own mitigation efforts according to their own resources, their success varying. The pandemic arguably exposed both the promise and failings of online education, and of course, the future today appears uncertain. This concludes the third and final video on the history of American education, this one looking at the years following World War II.